context of the new caucus, what was happening politically. We're going to start out with Christie in office and Booker and the financialization of the profit motive, neoliberalism, and how that basically transformed the schools. So Christie is in office and the second term of Mayor Booker. Mayor Booker meets with Zuckerberg in a casual conversation. Of course, it's California, which he likes to go to. There's a lot of stars there, famous people. And the donation of $100 million happens for Newark. The Cami Anderson, who was a former assistant superintendent of the District 79 in New York City, was brought in, ushered in, because we were under state control through the help of Mayor Booker in 2011. Cami previously worked on Mayor Booker's campaign and was involved in Teach for America and various programs which got people graduate from universities with little experience, only 5 weeks of training, TFI, to work in different majority urban and some rural schools. So we're going to talk about the major factors that brought about Newark. It basically was a test case in financialization and neoliberal reform. So we're seeing a time of market expansion was one of the major focuses that happened, and this was the charter chain industry. This is funded under Clinton, which is, Clinton started this called the New Market Tax Credit, which was passed under the Clinton administration. So what this did was enable hedge funds to get 40% tax breaks over 5-year investments in charters. As a result, there were rapid expansions of charters and co-locations, which means shared space. So basically what was happening was that brick and mortar schools like 18th Avenue were being sold through basically $1, and they're being financed by the same people that were connected to the charter industry, like KIP, and one basically financial organization was called Pink Hula Hoop that enabled this financial takeover of these buildings, which are basically like 1890, some of these buildings. So there's another interesting point is the infrastructure was not so great. So now all of a sudden we are managing to take over existing buildings that are old, and now they're being fixed up. So we can't do that under a previous funding, which should be going to the schools, but we somehow can do that when it involves market. So this is basically when we're talking about school reform. This was practiced throughout several cities, as in one of the major, and by the way, the prerequisite to be involved in, be a principal or a leader is to have as little experience as possible. So Michelle Rhee came in Washington, D.C., 2007, 2015, falsified data in terms of testing, repression, and there's a test-based test and repeat and basically regurgitate testing, in other words. So we're using the testing as a cudgel against students, but also against the teachers, which I'll go over later on. So in order to actually have this false sense of equalization, there was something called One Newark. One Newark was there so that we the same people that you can register for any school you want to. You don't have a neighborhood school. The idea is to break apart neighborhood schools, which is basically the anchor of the community, and organizing, by the way. So it actually does two things. It prevents organizing because you now have people moving who are not necessarily in the school. It adds 1/3 in some cases of special ed students in one school to the other. So the principals are not particularly prepared or ready for this. And the second thing, this is very important, is we have something called choice. So this is what is repeated over and over again, choice. So what you do is you repeat something over and over. You say, well, you have choice now. You can go to any school you want. What does that do? That actually, and it's very weird, but this reminds me a lot of what happened on September 11th, 1973. Even though this is a country called Chile, which was, we have Salvador Allende deposed by terrorism sponsored by the US. We have what we call the Chicago Boys come in and they take over and make what we call a neoliberal experiment. And why am I saying that? Is because what happens is the people who are getting pensions or life insurance cannot depend on that anymore, because now it's something you have to contribute to. So now you have choice. Now this is interesting because the military retained the state pension. That was fine for them. They didn't have to have the quote choice unquote. This is a similar situation in Newark. As a matter of fact, if you talk to a lot of the shall we say school deformed people who I have discussed, they say the same thing over and over. They talk about choice. They say the parents elected to go to these schools. What can you do? Because they eliminated their schools. That's why they were going to other schools. And there's other reasons also. So what does the school reform? And by the way, there was a school reform before that. Actually was real school reform, where we talked about whole school reform, where we talk about community and we talk about learning. We're taking learning out of the schools because most of it is what was, I think I talk about it later, about the core contact curriculum standards, meeting certain standards. So it's not talking about what's really happening between the child, what's happening with the family, it's more concentrating on what's happening with what we call data, which is another word you're going to hear over and over again. Like nobody ever sort of like measured how progress was before this was happening. So we're separating the activity of learning from the context of family and community. It emphasizes achievement through tests, and thus the teacher is measured, test as well as the students. So we're decoupling learning and making that into sort of like a blind just testing. Now, school reform does not take into account other factors affected, of course. So there's a whole lot of factors, poverty and stuff, and they're saying that's no effect on achievement. As a matter of fact, 14% of the achievement comes from the school. The rest, other factors, are from social and other factors that support the student to learn. So there also is a big thing that they say, oh, poverty doesn't matter in terms of how children are doing. And that's a main thing, that's a main thrust of what we call school reform. So the core content standards. So basically what happens is that this core content standards, which is basically everywhere in New Jersey, but it's much more, shall we say, used or promoted in terms of less flexibility in Newark, and in the 2009 high school standards, according to Chris Tenkin of the Seton Hall. Before we had core content standards, there was much more creativity and thinking in the curriculum as measured by the DOL, Dimensions of Learning. So basically, these standards have lowered thinking skills that we need. So this brings us up to the new contract. Using the Facebook money, Joe DeGrazzo and the President of the Union sells the contract that there will be no money coming in. There's no money coming in. We have Facebook money that's going to be used. So the people sort of buy this. And Randy Weingarten says proudly that she personally helped negotiate this contract. So basically, the contract was, along with their partner of DeGrazzo,
Okay.
our union supporting this very regressive contract. The second thing it does is transition to universal pay scale. So the previous scale, you would have like masters and whatever. Universal means that new people who are coming in would be in a scale which added tons and tons of steps. So the mid-level or beginning career would take them like 18 steps, like huge amounts of steps to actually make their make enough money to survive. So consequently, we started losing, and we still are losing a lot of teachers to like Elizabeth and other schools because of this. So this contract was the model for also merit pay. And eventually, anyway, okay, so the merit pay is basically providing more money for people that get better evaluations, which is also used as a punishment mechanism because a lot of the principals don't understand learning either. And what happened was there was no research to merit pay. As a matter of fact, if you go look at Deci and Ryan, the intrinsic motivation is the biggest factor. Actually working with people, doing what you like to do is the factor for doing better at what you're doing. And in the corporate sector, Daniel Pink, of course, goes over that. So new caucus, which consists of members and NPS employees, which is unique in that respect, because when we started, we always had community members and people coming in. You know, of course, when we already became a slate, that would be people from NPS, but it was wonderful because we have a broad amount of different kinds of people from different views coming to our meetings. We had a first contract. We fought against this particular contract. We had Hurricane Sandy. So that went into reducing the amount of people voting. But I would say, I think that this was a pretty good gain for new caucus because we got a lot of votes against this contract. And then we had the first election, United for Change. We have Brandon Rippey. We have several people that got in 17 of 18 votes into 2013 elections. But here's what we have to learn about organizing is that, and we're going to talk about this later, is that we were trying to, and Al, who's with us, and other people were meeting with the people that won and continuing the social justice caucus, which we were founded on. And basically the social justice caucus was very difficult to get people still involved in the new caucus and also new visions, the bridge between that. And the other issue was this very repressive structure in terms of the people that are leaders of 1019 NTU who have been there for a very long time. So people got very depressed and left or actually not speaking out, but we still have people on the board that are executive board of NTU that are speaking out and trying their best despite the challenges. So the community continues to fight, and that becomes a very, very good fight against One Newark. And then he has, then we have, he has some commitment to act as, even as Andy sells him as a nice guy. Oh, I'm sorry, that Surf comes on board. And Randy Weingarten sells this guy Surf, who was a previous superintendent, who was a previous, ran the whole state education commissioner, says that we can work with him, he's a nice guy. So this is where, this is basically a movement to, there's a movement to return to local control at the same time. We've been under state control since 1995. So I forgot to mention that we had a good moment in terms of protests because the Newark Students Union was parallel to working with us. So there's an historic demonstration sit-in by the Newark Students Union. That's February 20th, February 20th, 2015, in 2 Cedar Street, which is our previous headquarters. June 23rd, 2015, New Visions. It's now called New Visions, which is people who are, we get to be candidates or work to be candidates from New Caucus. We lose the election, it gets split. We have the transition to local control between city and superintendent, and we have something called a roadmap document, and we return to local control. So when we're returning to local control, there is some point, a state entity that is doing the transition. There's no reason for a state entity with Ras Baraka meeting with the leader of the Newark Students Union, and whatever deal happened to be made, we returned to local control September 13th, 2017. February 2000, the SURF leaves and Roger Leonard becomes the superintendent. Despite the negotiations, even though Mayor Ras Baraka promotes, Ras Baraka continually promotes, first it's mixed, and Blair Owens, who is here, who was one of our chief, she's here on with us, is a fabulous organizer, and now a professor, PhD, actually studied organizing, which is part of her thesis, but she becomes on the school board, April 19th, 2016. So now we were been fighting a lot for what's going on in terms of making changes. But what happens is, as a lot of these things happen, is people get co-opted by the perception of who the mayor is, because he was an activist, and a lot of the perception is that, oh well, he couldn't do that. Is he really for charter? Well, now I must say we're not having, which I didn't talk about before, there was a brutal getting rid of tenured teachers. Like, she was tremendously vicious, Cami Anderson, to the point that Arnie Duncan said to her, why don't you lighten up a little bit? I mean, this was like unheard of. So that provided, unfortunately, crisis provides sometimes a huge opportunity for protest. So we're going to briefly talk about, after I finish this, then Yvette's going to talk about the lead in the water. So lead in the school found in 2016, and the water fountains on all the schools are turned off. According to the New York Times, the city public school met the standards of remediation, did not meet the standards of remediation because there's 15 ppbs, parts per billion, in 2010 to 2011 and 2011 to 2012. So you're going to have new structures that are being developed by the financial industry and the real estate brokers that are beautiful, but we are going to do deferred maintenance and neglect underground. That's the common thing of neoliberals, is to everything is basically in partnership with financial entities in order to, you want basically to have Goldman Sachs and other financial people to take over in partnership, quote unquote. New Caucus is asked by NRDC a notice of intent to be sued is filed on April 24th, 2008. New is engaged in education reforms as well as working with the Newark Water Coalition, and they get a lot of good, incredible coverage. So anyway, that we can, that Jordan can speak to that now.